It's Thursday, September 26th, 2024, and we are 39 days away from the election. Welcome to today's Make It Make Sense mini-episode. I'm Grant Herms. On the show today, Kamala Harris gives a big speech in Pittsburgh and gives her first sit-down interview on a major network as she works to reframe her economic policies. So for a little background here, the economy and inflation have remained the top issue for voters by a pretty good margin throughout the entire race, both when it was Biden and now that it's Harris. And I'm pulling from the most recent CBS YouGov poll here, which found that most people still think the economy is doing poorly right now, but that is shifting by only a few percentage points. But when we're talking about a race that's as close as this one is going to be, a few points matter. And as that's been shifting, Harris has made up quite a bit of ground when it comes to how confident people feel about how she would handle the economy. Trump versus Biden, the average on the economy was somewhere around 12 to 15 points in Trump's favor. Harris has now shrunk that to 4 points. In another recent poll, it was just 2 points. While that is good for her and bad for Trump, Harris is still having trouble explaining her economic plan. I've talked about this a bit before, and it seems like the campaign is now just repackaging her proposals to explain them a little more and to make them resonate a little more. So at this speech in Pittsburgh, she opened with the success of the Biden administration when it came to jobs and economic recovery after the pandemic, which the U.S. has recovered better than any other developed country since the pandemic right now. She also hit on the unemployment numbers that have reached a near record low and the Fed cutting the interest rate earlier this week. But she leaned in really hard to saying that she understands that those things don't necessarily mean that people feel better or are better off, because those big economic shifts take time to spread out. It was also a real reframing for her in this speech to pivot into union workers and working class Americans in a way that felt more sincere, or at least felt more thoughtful about how she was talking about and to those people. So far in this campaign, she's done a lot of the lip service you hear from Democrats, that they're the party of labor or the party of the working man and woman, but then she would just delegate the actual outreach to Walz or to somebody else, which made this speech feel a little different. Listen to this part where she contrasted herself with Trump.
You see, for Donald Trump, our economy works best if it works for those who own the big skyscrapers, not those who actually build them, not those who wire them, not those who mop the floors, Well, I have a very different vision. I have a very different vision for our economy. I believe we need to grow our middle class and make sure our economy works for everyone, for people.
So the speech was also a step more towards what we're used to hearing from Democrats on the economy as a whole. Not that her plans and policies were ever out on a limb, because they weren't, but her campaign struggled to define her policies and her vision really well. And because of that, it's been co-opted by the Trump campaign as radical and socialist, a lot of scaring voters about her housing plan or the plan to bring down prices on groceries or her capital gains tax plan. And I'm not going to break all that down here. I've done that already in a side-by-side comparison of Trump and Harris and their economic plans in a previous episode of the podcast, and it's up on the Substack right now, so you can go check those out for the full thing. It'll also be part of the voter guide that I'll be putting out here in the coming days, so you can have something right at your fingertips before and when you go into the voting booth. Anyway, Harris made a real plea to the middle class and came across as pragmatic. It felt much more grounded than some of her other economic speeches have been. So the thing was that she has really talked a lot about in this speech the same plans that she's had from the beginning, just a reframing at building wealth in the middle class. But again, she was pretty short on how that would work, exactly how the housing plan would work, how the first-time home buyer or startup loans would get paid for, or how she would safeguard against those with fears about too much government involvement in the economy when it came to things like price gouging. She talked a lot about the new energy innovation she wanted to do and keeping American industry and work in the U.S., a pretty important thing when you're talking about American workers and American industries like steel or natural gas in Pennsylvania. But in the end, her reframing speech was, like I said, a little short on policy. That, however, came later last night when Harris sat down on MSNBC with host Stephanie Ruhle. Now, I know what a lot of you were thinking. It was on MSNBC, so it must have been a fluff interview. I don't actually think that it was. It was certainly a much more friendly environment than, say, a more traditional outlet like an NBC or an ABC or a CBS or a CNN. But it certainly wasn't as friendly as Trump on Fox and Friends in the morning. Ruhle asked some pretty smart questions and pushed a little when Harris started to do that politician thing where they answer without actually having an answer, or other times she just let Harris kind of twist herself up a little bit. Take what was essentially the first question on taxes, where Harris pretty clearly had laid out her plan that no one's taxes would go up if they made under $400,000 a year, and for most people, taxes would go down, and the difference will be made up by raising corporate taxes and taxes on the wealthiest Americans. Now, she said it in a way that felt like she's been working on it so that people understand what her tax plan is, and I think one of the biggest moments actually came right after that.
And expanding that child tax credit, or you mentioned housing before, giving that extra money for a first home. If you can't raise corporate taxes, or if GOP takes control of the Senate, where do you get the money to do that? Do you still go forward with those plans and borrow?
Well, but we're going to have to raise corporate taxes, and we're going to have to make sure that the biggest corporations and billionaires pay their fair share. That's just it. It's about paying their fair share. I am not mad at anyone for achieving success, but everyone should pay their fair share. And it is not right that the teachers and the firefighters that I meet every day across our country are paying a higher tax than the richest people in our country.
It's worth pointing out here that she didn't actually answer the question there, whether it was because she doesn't have a plan B worked out or whether she's just hitting on her plan because it's her plan to win the White House. She's not going to, veer into a place where it makes it look like she's not confident in her own plans. But it was the clearest message that could be and would be her focus to tip the scales in favor of the middle class and lower income Americans and close the income gap, which this year meant that the top 10% of Americans had about 70% of all the wealth in the country, where the bottom 10% had just under 3%. The part of the plan to close the gap, Harris said, was her housing plan, and she laid that out again. I've talked about this before. It's the tax incentives and tax breaks for local and state construction and contracting companies to build 3 million new housing units to buy or to rent, along with giving first-time home buyers $25,000 to go towards their down payments. But she also, for the first time, said it meant cutting through a lot of local red tape, local bureaucracies, to get through what housing advocates have been decrying for years as NIMBY laws. That's N-I-M-B-Y. It means not in my backyard. They've prevented developers from building multifamily homes or apartment complexes with renters, which a lot of cities and towns have blocked from being built because they think that those kinds of developments increase crime or decrease property value. The U.S. Census actually found that neither of those things are true. And Harris also brought up the need to work with cities and towns once those houses are built to work on transportation so that people can get to work and live in those new homes. So for Harris to talk about the specifics in this way about housing was a real change for her campaign. She also talked about making sure U.S. Steel stayed in the U.S. Currently, a Japanese company is trying to buy U.S. Steel, which has been opposed by the Biden administration, both parties in Congress, Trump and now Harris. We hadn't heard that from her yet. She talked a lot about Trump, too, in this interview, don't get me wrong, and the problems with his plan, particularly when it came to tariffs. Trump is proposing pretty big tariffs on foreign goods pretty much across the board. Take a listen to what Harris had to say.
The sales tax of doing a 20% tariffs on all imports that he has described would be a 20% sales tax, in essence, on basic necessities for the average American worker, average American family, totaling almost $4,000 a year. That is no small matter. Here in Pittsburgh, when I'm talking to a group of folks who work here, who live here, and when they hear it might be $4,000 more a year for them, look, People can't afford that.
But tariffs aren't unique to President Trump. President Biden has tariffs in place. He's actually looking to potentially implement more. Where do you come out on? Is there a good tariff, a bad tariff?
Well, part of it is you don't just throw around the idea of just tariffs across the board, and that's part of the problem with Donald Trump. Frankly, and I say this in all sincerity, he's just not very serious about how he thinks about some of these issues. And one must be serious and have a plan, and a real plan that's not just about some talking point ending in an exclamation at a political rally.
So apart from her getting a jab in there, in terms of the tone, that might have been one of the better answers she had, at least coming across as pragmatic, and that in contrast, that she was a serious thinker about this. And in the video, you could see that on her face. Harris talked a little more about the economics of it all, but in terms of character and tone, which I think, too, is a reason that these kinds of interviews are important for giving us insight into who might be president, Harris's answer and the time that she spent on this answer about her time spent working at McDonald's, I thought was really interesting. And for those of you who don't know, Harris has talked about working at McDonald's over the course of this campaign when she was a student, but critics and far-right trolls have said that she's lying about ever working in McDonald's because it wasn't on her legal resume, like her resume to be a lawyer. And Trump has been kind of weirdly obsessed with it lately, but at any rate, here's her answer.
Working at a McDonald's, yes or no? That's it.
I have.
Okay, now the other job.
But it was not a small job. Like, I did the fries. I mean, yes.
Okay, for a small
I did.
period of time. But then let me ask about a big job.
But to your point, if you don't mind, before you get to the big job, there's a part of the reason I even talk about having worked at McDonald's is because there are people who work at McDonald's in our country who are trying to raise a family. I worked there as a student. I was a kid who worked there trying to raise families and pay rent on that. And I think part of the difference between me and my opponent includes our perspective on the needs of the American people.
So the thing that struck me there was the I've been there aspect of Harris's personal story that she's tried to get across in other ways, but this one I think landed the best. Every candidate does some version of this kind of a thing. Some do it better than others. And I found this to be compelling of how Harris thinks and where her focus is. I've talked about this before with Harris, specifically when it was her husband, Doug Emhoff, at the DNC, who really humanized her. And I thought in terms of a moment where Harris needed to come across as more relatable, more human. This was it. It was also a purposeful comparison to Trump, who never had to work a job like that. And his persona has always been about the aspirational wealth rather than the relatable. Now, whether any of this works is something that will shake out over the next few days. Will an interview on MSNBC get enough traction for the Harris campaign? Will it matter to voters who generally see Republicans as the party of economics and business, so there's a built-in cultural bias that we have? Will it change the way Harris moves forward when she talks about her economic plans? Who knows? There are 5 weeks left in this election, and anyone's guess is as good as mine. Okay, that is it for today's MIMS Mini. Thank you so much for listening. Please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you're using. You could like and subscribe on YouTube so this video shows up and the next videos show up in your recommendations. Also, subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I said I've got that voter guide coming out very soon. I'm still working on it right now. And keep sharing the show on social media. It's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word, on every platform. I'm at Grant Herms on X and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.